Okay, what is going on, everybody? Welcome back to the Parallax Viewer. I am your host, Big Signorelli, aka Andrew Flores, and I'm excited for this discussion on an ongoing series that I guess I'm compelled to do on the Acree. As many of you saw, the Graph of Desire, people have been very appreciative about that. And so I think it's important to not only delve into the seminars, but also in conjunction, delve into a lot of the important essays from the Acree from Lacan. And so today I will be discussing Kant Avec Sade with Luis Vega. Many of you who follow the Emancipations podcast hosted by Daniel Tutt and the study groups on psychoanalysis and Marxism. Luis has been an ongoing member slash comrade with a lot of great contributions, especially with helping us on the Kant Avec Sade series that we recently did with Daniel. So I think that's why it was important that I had this discussion with him, because he's currently working on this right now. He's a student at University of Ghent working on his PhD around the invocatory drive. And so this essay, as well as studies on like a Lacanian theory of perversion, have been very important for his work. So it's great to have you, Luis.
Thank you for the invite, and hopefully we can dissect this text that is known for being very difficult, right? So we will do whatever is possible.
Yeah, and not only that, like touch upon a lot of the intricacies of Kant. And I know like behind the recording, we were talking about even the work from Alenka Zupanchit's on Ethics of the Real, which touches on the Kantian and Sadean ethics as well. I guess to really start off the conversation with one crucial point, the title of the essay is Kant Avec Sade, or Kant with Sade. And what I guess this essay orients itself around is, desire and the moral law, and also jouissance, but how Marquis de Sade is the truth of Kant. And in that sense, he, correct me if I'm wrong, he takes the what Kant calls the categorical imperative, or his moral law, his ethical theory, to its limit, or actualizes it in a different way. But that doesn't mean to say that Kant himself is a Sadean or a sadist or a pervert. They don't have a rapprochement in that sense. They don't go together. Mm-hmm. Jacques-Alain Miller will say in his lecture on it that this doesn't mean that Kant and Sade are in a happy marriage together. So what does that mean, that Sade is the truth of Kant?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, just to give a little bit background to the text the work of the Marquis de Sade was forbidden for many years in France. And by this time, when Lacan is writing this text, this new edition of the work of Marquis de Sade were available for the first time. And he was asked to write a preface, right? And he writes this crazy text that was rejected many times. But because he's Lacan, he's famous, they finally added to the completed works of the Marquis de Sade, right? And we need to understand that this text comes few years after we have Seminar 7, the Ethics of Psychoanalysis, when Lacan talks about Kant and Sade, right? And of course, Antigone, right? So there is this relationship precisely upon pain, the pain in which both the neurotic and the sadist are in contact, right? Their ethics are grounded on this relationship to pain, right? Now, how they approach it is not the same, right? And that's how I think we can differentiate them. Now, what is the truth of Kant, right? How Sade reveals the truth of Kant, I think it's precisely in the split between the subject of enunciation and the subject of the statement, right? That we will explain later, right? So for which Lacan says that in Kant, this division is hidden. But in the case of the sadist, it is revealed in the way the sadist exposes the superego by demanding the victim to to submit to his will, right? So when in the case of Kant, this is internalized, right? If we use the same metaphor, the sadist and the victim is the same person, right? So the division is much more murky with Kant, right?
And it's interesting because like I mean there's a lot to touch on there, but with the philosophy in the bedroom, which is like the most quoted text by Marquis de Sade in the essay, there's like, you know, both like a political proclamation for the development of the French Republic that Sade is cultivating. But at the same time, there's also this polemical battle against what he sees as problematic with the France contemporary of his time, which is Christianity. And so, like, there's also the distinction right there in which, for Kant, right, there is a Christian quality to him, even if, like, you know, he's not necessarily making it explicitly Christian. I mean, he has his own critiques of religion. Um, you know, he as Lacerda says, like, you know, he goes through his own form of self censorship, and then like after the death of who was it? What was one of the kings of Prussia that he you know you know vowed not to write anything against religion. Then you know writes that essay upon his death of religion within the bounds of reason, I believe it's called. Um,
Mm-hmm.
but with that being said, like there is a sort of secularization of like the Christian law of you know people are ends, not means to an end, as well as like the goodwill and the categorical imperative versus Sade, who Sade like is against Christianity. He kind of has like this flavor of you know a return to a paganist mystery rite of like Venus or Aphrodite in a lot of these you know themes of the text. But I found that sort of interesting as well, that even though he's the truth of Kant, he takes it in a more like hedonistic pagan way compared to the decadence that he thinks of Christianity, and how his republic will be defined by is like this anti-Christian hedonism, for lack of a better term.
Yeah, I mean, if we take in these streams, we can see how. I mean, it's almost nonsensical to think how is Kant even related to Sade, right? Because we have a pious person like Kant, who was a bachelor for his whole life, right? And then we have Sade, who is unhinged and doing whatever he wanted, right? And seeking enjoyment, right? And how are both related, right? Is the question. And but it's precisely, I think, the fact that in the case of Sade that becomes a Kantian, as you mentioned before, right? So, and it is precisely, I think, on the definition of enjoyment that we can see the core difference, right? How enjoyment joins them together, but
Mm-hmm.
in a different way, in their relationship to pain, right?
Yeah,
Because
yeah,
it's exactly the relationship to pain that defines jouissance,
right.
defines what is beyond the pleasure principle, right?
And I think that will tie into the next point, because like with the start of the essay, he says, you know, even though it's Kant with Sade, he says that the notion of Sade's work anticipated Freud's. You know, and then he goes on to say that if Freud was able to enunciate his pleasure principle without ever having to worry about indicating what distinguishes it from the function of pleasure in traditional ethics, um, you know, and then he goes on and on and on. But like, I think what you said brings us to this point about what is the relationship to um, Freud and Freud's work being anticipated with not only pain, this notion of pain that you brought up, but the notion of pain with relation to Freud's discovery of the unconscious mechanisms which are governed by the pleasure principle. And you mentioned earlier the distinction between the neurotic and the pervert. And you know, in psychoanalytic theory, we have said, you know, that the neurotic could have perverse fantasies, but that doesn't make them a pervert as such. And I think it's because with the discovery of the pleasure principle, which for Freud aims at homeostasis, um, at the same time, for the neurotic, there's a fundamental prohibition. But we see something different in Sade, but it relates to this anticipation of what Freud will entitle the pleasure principle. So, yeah, like let's unpack that a lot more and how it relates to even the sadean bedroom, which is analogous to the lyceum, right? Of,
Exactly.
you know,
Exactly.
it's a school, you know.
Yeah, exactly. It's in a school, and precisely in the philosophy in the bedroom, what is a school? What is the teaching? Like we can ask, right? So, philosophy in the bedroom is a bad translation. I think that's one issue, because in French is la philosophie dans le boudoir, and the
Well, yeah.
boudoir is not the bedroom. And
Mm-hmm.
that's, I think, one of the misconceptions that comes from this idea of the sadists that doing philosophy in the bedroom, because the boudoir is a space between the bedroom and the living room. So where women used to change or do their makeup, and they used to chat. So it's precisely this space between the bedroom and the public space. So it's this in between where they can still discuss about matters that are more private, but not the bedroom, when we can think, oh, this is they're just doing sex, right? So it's precisely this space between, discussion, but still not public space where there are more prohibitions of what can be said, right? So
Which is
that's
synonymous with the
mhm,
clinical couch, right? Which is like,
yeah,
almost similar, in which it's like this in between the private and the public.
yeah, precisely. And it is exactly in the case that there can be some liberation from, in the case of Sartre, he was trying to discuss this new republic free from doctrines of Christianity, right? That I think his Lyceum, his Stoa, his boudoir, precise, right? It is grounded on the liberation from the Christian doctrine, right? And it is, I think, it is precisely in this case that we can understand how, after uh, the publication of these scandalous works, for them Freud to write about sexuality is not is much more palatable, it's much more accessible, right? And I think this is how Lacan reads it, right? So Sade, by writing these perverse texts, allow Freud to then propose a pleasure principle by uh, claiming that pleasure is not defined by morality. And this is what we have with Sade, right? We have an access to pleasure and enjoyment that is not defined by Christian morality, because traditionally we have a symmetry between happiness, that's how we understand the goal of pleasure, happiness, and the good, right? And that's how we move to how that relates to Kant, right? Because there is, as he, as the Lacan talks, there is a difference between bien in French, that is both good and well-being, right? And how there is no such uh, relationship in German. There are two words, right? The guten, and I forgot the other word. He mentions it. Uh, wool, wool, right? So there are two different words. Well-being and good are not the same, but in French it's the same, right? So he makes this reference to the fact that there has been always this unity between happiness and the good. And precisely with Sade, there is no such connection. You can enjoy, you can find happiness in your own sexual activity that is not defined by any doctrine, right? So that opens a space for then uh, Freud talk about how sexuality is really much more open than we have defined it, right? So I think that's the link, right, between Sade and Freud and the pleasure principle.
Right. And to kind of piggyback off of that, it's also interesting when you look at the three essays of sexuality in Freud, that, sexuality and its structure is not bounded by moral law, as you said, and its aim, its source is not immorality, nor is it in the natural law. And so because of that, all these normative claims of certain sexuality or certain preferences to be perverse or inverse are not that much pathological. In fact, the classically deemed heterosexual position is actually, in some instances more pathological than the deemed pathological. And so of course we get Freud's like radical shift of that in his investigation of sexuality, but also infantile sexuality. But at the same time, that in its search for satisfaction, whatever that object is, it derails that in the process. It inhibits itself from that. I mean, we see that in infantile neurosis, in neurotics, the inhibition, and the problem of sublimation as well. And I don't think he necessarily, like Kant necessarily says this in this essay, but I think I got this from a specific Lacanian that I'm friends and colleagues with, that the pervert, in a sense, is the master of sublimation, because sure, like the pervert will find pleasure in sexuality that is not bound by morality, but at the same time, it is not reducible to the act of intercourse. In fact, it becomes a sort of sublimated technique that has a sort of higher function or higher culture, but it still relies on the other, right?
Yeah, I mean, my reading of Perversion, like the case of Sade, is that how this is how maybe we can distinguish Sade from Kant,
Mhm.
is that Sade knows very well what he needs to do to get enjoyment, right?
Mm, mhm,
I
mhm,
need to torture the other,
mhm,
and I will gain enjoyment by that. It becomes
mhm,
very mechanic and repetitive, right? And
mhm,
that's the whole fantasy of repetition of destroying the good in the other. Well, in Kant, you can never be sure if you will gain the highest goods, happiness, right? Only God can tell you you finally achieve it. You're actually a good person, right? So there is no possibility of having enjoyment, of course, this full jouissance in this life for Kant. You can never be sure. And this is the aspect of knowledge that
mhm,
in the case of perversion is the contrary. I know very sure what I need to do. I know very sure how to manage the jouissance of the other. Right? And this is not, of course, what Lacan is saying in this text precisely. And again, this is why we need to understand that this is a preface to the work of Sade, right? So, and he makes sometimes very clear, for example, when he talks about comedy, that one of the things that could destroy or could go against the work of Sade is that he didn't have a sense of comedy, of a sense of humor, right? And but he claims that, well, this is too much to be discussed in this text because this is a preface. So he still tries to be nice to Sade because is going to be a preface to the work of Sade, right? But but the important thing about this text is that it is the most referred text by Lacan in other seminars, right? So even more than the subversion of the subject, right? So precisely because it is a text in which we have an understanding of jouissance. And even in seminar 16, he makes it clear how we cannot understand surplus jouissance through Kant Avec Sade, in the work of Kant Avec Sade, or to be more precise, in the case of Kant, right? But yeah, yeah. Um,
Yeah, no, that's really good. And I'm looking at the passage on pagination 766, if you have the Bruce Fink translation, six.
mhm.
But I think this ties in well with what you were saying about the distinction between vol, which is what well-being, right?
Well, I
And
mean,
again, the good. But like philosophy and like in like sort of moral theory or ethical theory has based itself as like happiness as the goal. But pleasure and well-being, like anything that provides displeasure, is obviously going to be deemed as bad, versus what brings pleasure is going to have the judgment of good, right? And
yeah,
Lacan says right here on that passage in the middle that the pleasure principle is the law of feeling good, which bien, and then which is wohl in the German might be rendered as well-being. In practice, this principle would submit the subject to the same phenomenal sequence that determines his object. The objection that Kant raises against this is in accordance with his rigorous style. No phenomenon can lay claim to the constant relationship to pleasure. No law of feeling good can thus be enunciated that would define the subject who puts it into practice as will. Now, of course, if you have anything to add, please do. But I like, this distinction that you made in passing about the other, because the other definitely relates more to Sade um, than it does to Kant. Because for Kant, it seems like the moral law relates more to the goodwill, right? Which is, if I'm practicing the moral law, it must come from not only my goodwill, but also the universal maxim, which could be valid in every instance. But it seems like for Sade, the presence of the other seems to be more important. Am I right in making that
Mm,
distinction?
it is more clear in Sat,
Yeah.
definitely, right? But I mean, let's go back a little bit. So what you mentioned about the feeling good, no law of feeling good can thus be enunciated that will define the subject who puts into practice as will, right? I think this is crucial about the pleasure principle and how there is a move between the pleasure principle to the reality principle, precisely because you cannot satisfy whatever you want, right? You cannot just say, okay, I have the need for food, and suddenly magically you will gain uh, the food that you want, right? Uh, you cannot always find satisfaction. You cannot always find pleasure, right? I cannot only a God will have that power, right? And that's why there is a necessary move to accept that, you cannot gain full satisfaction, right? And this is pretty much what we understand as castration, right? And how we move from the divisional object, and there is this identification with the object that we were just reading 7 or 9, right? Um, the other question about what was?
Oh, it was more along the line. I think it was, yeah, this the like the problem of the will in Kant versus the other in
Ah, the other.
yeah.
Yeah. So in the case, so okay, we understand that there is a contradiction of finding a absolute will that will just produce pleasure, right? And this is exactly why Kant uh, negates the he calls it the uh, empirical ethics. I'm not sure exactly, but so he relates that to uh, Epicurean. We can think of Aristotle too, Stoics, Spinoza. Uh, okay, not the Stoics precisely. Okay, it's Spinoza, and they have a conception of happiness, right? They have the idea that uh, what you need to do is the goal is happiness, and what you need to do is precisely to avoid, in the case of the hedonist, avoid extremes, right? So there is no rules of how to enjoy, right? Of how to find pleasure, but you need to avoid extremes. So too much pleasure creates some pleasure, right? So that needs to be avoided. So that's the well-being. I need to care about myself. This is my happiness, my well-being, and this is how I understand it to be good, right? The same with Aristotle. We can think there is the golden mean between what is can be considered a good action, right? So, and then from that we can understand there is a path for happiness, right? And Kant finds this problematic, right? Because how can you, there's impossibility of creating a universal rule, right? Because, okay, I like strawberry, some other person likes chocolate, right? How can we then agree what is good, right? It is empirically determined, right? It doesn't emerge from reason, right? That's why he proposes the idea that it cannot be determined by nature, by empirical conditions. It must come out of reason, out of the unconditional will of the subject. But at the moment of creating the categorical imperative, this imperative, because it's universal, uh, is taken as applicable to everyone. So there is the idea that nonetheless, it is it speaks from the place of the other. Because if it were to speak from my own subjectivity, it wouldn't be universal, right? So at the moment of enunciating and reaching a uh, universal uh, power, let's say, it needs to be objective, and therefore needs to, in the Lacanian sense, speak from the place of the other, right? So, so yeah, there is the aspect of the other in Kant too, right? But it's not as clear, let's say, as in Sade.
Yeah, no, that's really good. And I think like what like Kant's intervention is because like you mentioned the ancient hedonists like Epicureans that don't necessarily have like a law, but they just say like avoid excess, right? The goal is ataraxia, tranquility. And then like Aristotle's everybody like aims at the good, and the eudaimonia is what is attained a good life, which translates all the way down to pretty much Western philosophy up until Kant, and even his contemporaries in like the Anglosphere, like Hume, the utilitarians. It seems like it has to do with pleasure and displeasure, but at the level of not only some sort of like empirical materialism, but one of taste, right? I think Kant's formal reason goes beyond taste and these sort of immediate judgments. He wants to look for a sort of a more formal rules that can be maximized. And I think, at least to keep the conversation going in this direction, I do want to reference the passage that Lacan gives us in the essay, because the critique of practical reason is what he's referencing. And Kant, of course, has many other texts regarding ethics, like the metaphysics of morals, groundworks. But the critique of practical reason, he gives us these theorems, and it's the third theorem that we are focusing the most on in Kant Avec Sade. And so, I mean, I think you've already like laid some of the groundworks for it, but I'll just reference it right here. If a rational being is to think of his maxims as practical universal laws, then he could think of them only as principles that contain the determining basis of the will, not by their matters, but merely by their form. And I think that it's like it's that's the main thing. It's form. The matter of a practical principle is the object of the will, and this object either is the determining basis of the will, or it is not. And so he pretty much lays out the whole way in which that must be enacted as a universal legislation or a universal maxim. And he concludes the theorem by saying, therefore, a rational being either cannot think of his subjectively practiced principles, i.e., his maxims, at the same time as universal laws at all, or he must assume that the principles mere form by itself alone, whereby they are fitting for universal legislation, makes them practical laws. And in his comments, he gives this example of the deposit, right? He says, I have a deposit in my hand, the owner which is no longer living. He's deceased and has left no record of it. Naturally, this is the case for my maxim. Now, I want only to know whether the maxim can also hold as a universal practical law. So I apply the maxim to the present case and ask whether it could indeed take the form of a law, and I could thus indeed at the same time give through my maxim such a law as this, that everyone may deny a deposit which no one can prove to him to have been made. I immediately become aware that this such as a principle as a law would then annihilate itself, because it would bring it about that there would be no deposit at all, right? And so this is the sort of thing in which Kant is trying to qualify not only practical reasons, but practical laws and principles which adhere to this form, right? So it's a formal thing, as we're saying, not empirical matters. But this example is interesting because if we were to do something and make a maxim, there's the possibility of it annihilating itself upon acting out, right?
Yeah, and the case of the depositary is crucial to understand the truth of Kant that Sade reveals, right? But so that's in page 647 in the Fink edition, right? When he
Yes.
talks,
Yes.
in other words, there is no deposit without this depository worthy of this task, right?
Mm-hmm.
But before that, there is this little paradox that I find interesting, so I will just briefly talk about it. So we discussed the difference between the well-being and good, right? And Lacan refers that to the Stoics, right? And so how the Stoics had this relationship to pain that is very close to Kant, even though Kant also rejects the Stoics. So I just wanted to remark that. And then the paradox is, I will just read. Let us consider the paradox that is at the very moment at which subject no longer has any object before him, that he encounters a law that has no other phenomenon than something that is already signifying. The latter is obtained from the voice in conscience, which, articulating in the form of a maxim in conscience, proposes the order of a purely practical reason or will there. Right? And this is interesting because this is precisely how we can understand in the ego and the id, right?
Hmm.
The, the moment in which there is this separation from the parent,
Mhm.
but it is only possible by introjecting the paternal figure, right? The ego ideal, right? And precisely, we can read it in the Kantian sense by rejecting the pathological. It's only possible by emerging something within oneself. So the rejection of the pathological then returns in another form, in the form of the superego, the voice in conscious. But like Lacan claims, the phenomenon that has another law other than the phenomenon that something that is already signifying. And that's very
Mhm.
interesting. It says that it's already signifying.
Mhm.
And this is different from Kant, right? Because, and that's more psychoanalytic in the fact that the voice in conscious speaks a language of, they speak the language of the other, right? So it's not that you, from your pure reason, from your freedom, come up with the imperative, but it's already put into the language of the other, right? So it is already a signifying form to it, right? And this is a precise paradox in which, okay, I reject the pleasure, but then this returns, or reject the pathological, and then this returns in the superego, which
Mhm.
nonetheless satisfies its own desires, right? By, let's say, torturing us with its demands, right? Uh, but of course, this for Kant is not clear, right? And that's why the case of the depository, right, it claims that the depository needs to be worthy of this task. You need to have like a faithful depository, right?
Yeah.
If there is no faithful depository, there will be the universal maxim will crumble, right?
Yeah.
So Kant needs to have needs to reject the split between the the freedom of the subject that
Mhm.
enunciates the law and the law as understood, right?
The laws. Right. Right. Right.
So yeah, and this becomes clear when we discuss SAT, right? And the graphs.
Yeah. I mean, like, so in a sense, with at least going back to what you're saying with the example of the depository, he has to have a faithful one, because if you were to reject it based on the account of that there is no record, the law would crumble. And or to use his words, the law uh that I wish to universalize by denying would itself annihilate. Now, is that an example of it annihilating because it just doesn't work? Or is it the fact that in that specific instance, I would be acting pathologically, right? Because in a sense, even not even just that example, I know like Alenka touches upon this, that like I think it's in the example of the pathological subject that if I were to suspect that my spouse is cheating on me with my best friend, and I were to go over there and catch them and prove the infidelity, I would still be in the position of a pathological subject, not being able to universalize that maxim, because I acted out of jealousy, not out of some sort of maxim that would be able to validate itself in every situation, right?
Right. The thing is complex, right? Because Well, Lacan and Kant are not really speaking the same language. So when they refer to the pathological, they're not referring to the same thing, right? But we can see that in precisely in Kant, let's say, right, the superego nonetheless is enjoying, right?
Yeah.
And nonetheless, we can think of this enjoyment as pathological, right?
Uh-huh.
And and in the same way that you can never be sure that when I am enunciating the law, I am completely loyal to it, right? The subject doesn't fit into the statement of the law, right? And that's the issue. That Kant takes for granted the fact that when I speak, I am the same subject in my statement, right?
Right. Yeah.
I shall not lie, right? There is no split in this I. While for Lacan, there is exactly the difference between the parlete, the speaking being, right?
Mhm.
And the subject of the statement, the I of the statement, that is shifter, right?
Yeah,
And
yeah, and for like the viewers, like this becomes important because like explained in the intro to the graph that the difference between the subject of enunciation versus enunciated simply is like what is the said at the level of the statement, versus the act of speaking, and this becomes important for psychoanalytic work because the speaking, the act of speaking is put into question of like who is it that is speaking, because that is the at the level of the unconscious where we could say the law is operating, not on how it is said, right? The difference between the subject versus the I of the statement, right? Two different things.
yes, precisely, right? Because if we think, okay, when Kant thinks about the transcendental subject, we understand the will, right? But okay, we know Lacan doesn't believe in freedom. He criticized that many ways, right, during his text. But if we allow this place of freedom within Lacan's oeuvre, we will think, okay, it must be the freedom, but the freedom of the unconscious, right? But Kant doesn't have a concept of the unconscious, right? The
Right, right.
only conception of freedom must be of a certain kind of will, right?
Yeah.
And that's the fact that there is an unconscious is what allows to what makes clear that there is a difference in the subject. There is a split in the subject, right?
Hmm.
That
Hmm.
that is not the same as how Lacan understands it, right?
Right. You mentioned conscience in the voice of reason. Um and I know that was going to be one of our talking points. Could we dive into that, because I think that's going to help us build up the main points about these graphs that we keep referring to. But um apparently like in the text there is this paradox of the voice of reason and how it operates in Kant versus in Sade. Like the voice is everything, I think, to Sade and its relation to the other.
Uh-huh. Yeah, I mean, so there are two things, right? That's the particularly the paradox that I mentioned before about how the voice of conscious emerges by after a side effect of rejecting the pathological, nonetheless it returns in the voice of reason or the
Yes.
voice
Okay.
unconscious, right?
Okay.
But it is also present in Kant. In Kant text, right? That's a funny thing, right? Because okay, you will think, okay, there needs to be a reciprocal relationship between the the subject that enunciates the law and the law, right? The subject of the statement, right? But therefore, does that mean that we do we follow the law all the time, right? Is there a freedom from the moral law, right? And that's precisely because there is this possibility of doing evil, right?
Mhm.
That Lacan introduces during his text the fact that if someone were to act against the moral law, they will hear the voice of reason, right? So
Yeah.
they will hear the superego. And this is what Lacan claims that we encounter anew here what led Kant to express his regret that no intuition offers upon an object, a phenomenal object in the experience of the moral law, right?
Right.
I agree that this object slips away through the critique, but it can be surmised in the trace left by the implications which Kant
Mhm.
provides to demonstrate. Well, anyways, uh, it's precisely that Kant, this is a problem for Kant because the fact that you hear a voice of reason it's still a phenomenon, right? So it speaks from the place of the other, right? It conditions you to follow the moral law, and this
Right.
is contradictory for Kant in a way, because it grounds morality on some certain kind of fear, certain kind of pain, right, of suffering, which, in contrast to Rousseau, Kant needs to ground ethics on reason alone and not on fear or passions, right? So this is a contradiction, and that Lacan reveals, right? That nonetheless, this slips through the critique, right? That there is the phenomenological object of the voice of reason, right? Because even if it's internal, it's still a phenomenon. It is still in an inner sense, right? And as we mentioned before, the categorical imperative cannot emerge through empirical conditions, right? And the fact that there is this inner sense demands me to act in certain way is a contradiction, right? So so
Right.
that's a turning point.
Yeah, and I'm thinking back about what you were saying too about like with the categorical imperative, there isn't this guarantee of, let's say pleasure or happiness because it's all about following the form and in each instance in which you repeat. And for Sade, it's like what he wants to do is to, in his maxim, he says, I have the right to enjoy your body. And Lacan cites this: I have the right to enjoy your body. Anyone can say to me, and I will exercise the right without any limit to the capriciousness of the exaction I may wish to satiate with your body. Right. And so, satisfaction or enjoyment seems to be the end, but still enunciated by a maxim, right? And so I think that is from reading that, the distinction between Kant and Sade, but Sade still using the universal maxim in, this way in which he says, I have the right to enjoy your body, and then anybody could retort back to me something of a maxim as well. I think this brings up the problem that I think that you mentioned earlier, before the recording, that I think we should talk about too. And it's this maybe not necessarily a problem, but this key point about Kant and Sadian ethics, and that's reciprocity, right? Um, I think we should touch in on this problem of reciprocity. And I think this also has a psychoanalytic dimension because we talk about, the non-rapport, or the distinction between how, a subject of desire relates to the other and relates to sort of enjoyment as well. It's asymmetrical.
Yeah, right. So reciprocity, Lacan refers to reciprocity in the text, but as I mentioned before, I hinted before, there is a necessary reciprocity between the transcendental subject and the moral law, right? This is not exactly what like how Lacan talks about it, but I think it's clear if we define it this way, because in the first critique, so Kant only thought about writing the first critique, right? He thought, okay, I'm going to write this and I'm done. But then he had some critiques, and also he read Rousseau, The Meal, and Rousseau's Emile is a text about the education of children, in which Rousseau claims that children using their own reason can come up with morality, right? And this is a turning point for Kant, because the problem of freedom in the first critique is that of the third antinomy, right? So are we free or not? Okay, we can resolve this antinomy by saying that, okay, if freedom is possible, it must be outside of the change of causations, right? It must not be included into the phenomenal world, but into the noumenal world, right? But it's still, because it's noumenal, we have no knowledge about it. So there is a negative relationship to freedom, right? We don't know if we're free. But by the introduction of the moral law, the second critique on the groundworks, to the moral law is what allows us to know that we are free, right? So there is a positive relationship to freedom. But Kant thinks that there is a reciprocity between freedom, or the transcendental subject, and the moral law, because it is a subject by its own unconditional will that enunciates the law, and the moral law, therefore, is what makes us know that we are being free or not, right? If I am following the law, then I'm free, right? So I know that I am free because I am following the law. It is clear from that sense, right? But in this case, there is a reciprocity between the two, right? And of course, this issue of reciprocity between these two, let's say, these two aspects of the subject, right, um, clashes when with Lacan's understanding of the relationship between the subject and the object, right? Precisely because in the case of how we saw before, how the voice of reason demands the subject to act in a certain way, to follow the law. It shows itself that there is a split between the freedom of the subject and the moral law, right? The subject is not completely united with the moral law, right? And is therefore uh, free from it, right? And it's also clear in Kant in a certain way. But from it, we can see how this imperative, the maxim of the state is, I have the right to enjoy your body, not only shows that anyone can say to me, so this is crucial, right? It says anyone can say to me. So meaning that this maxim speaks from the place of the other, right? And okay, this has some ramifications, right? So first is the fact that it speaks from the place of the other, and it talks about the enjoyment that the superego has upon the subject, and also the fact that I can also I can also enunciate it. I can also demand these rights, but by doing so, in the case of Sad, someone else can also do the same to me. So if I want to kill someone, I have the right, but by doing so, someone else also has the right to kill me, right? But well, that's the case of Sad, right? So going back to this reciprocity, we can see that okay, yeah, following this example, right? For example, I want to kill someone becomes my object, right? There is no reciprocity between the two. I am the one acting the killing, and the other one is being killed, right? So there is no reciprocity between the two of them, right? But nevertheless, this can shift, right? And someone else can become the active subject, and me the passive victim of this right of the
Right.
other to do whatever they want to me.
And this is a good point because again, now I'm thinking about, the thing that's always being criticized when it comes to Kant's ethical theory is, of course, the categorical imperative, and the example of you shouldn't tell a lie, right? And this, caricature of it, of like, suppose that a gunman comes to your door and asks if your grandmother or mother answers the door, and they ask if you're home. Well, if they lie to cover your ass, sure, you may be safe, but the example is like, well, what if you get out the back door and then there happens to be another gunman there and then you get shot? Well, the outcome definitely was still like didn't work in your favor, but the moral law isn't about like the outcome. It's about, the form of it and it working and validating itself in each instance. And so the reality of Kant's thou shalt not tell a lie is because, well, if everybody in society was doing that, then nobody would believe anybody, because you have the maxim to tell a lie, right?
Okay.
Because universalize that, nobody would trust anybody, and truth itself would sort of erase, or the possibility of even distinguishing between truth and a lie would somehow erase itself. And so I think that's sort of interesting regarding reason, right? But in this instance, the Sadean maxim is affirming the possibility of not only having the right to kill somebody or having the right to enjoy one's body to the best of my ability, but that can be also enacted on me as well, whether I am going to be killed, I am the passive object, or I'm the object to be enjoyed, right? Um, yeah, that's what I wanted to add to
Yeah,
that.
yeah, precisely because this is not a categorical imperative as universal, but a maxim. And that's why Lacan claims that this at most can be generalized, right? But it cannot
Mm-hmm.
be universal, because by universal you need a reciprocity, right? But nevertheless, right, the case of the lie, and this is precisely how Lacan understands the paradox of lying in relationship to the subject of enunciation, right? because it becomes clear in this case, right? For example, this is the famous case, right? Will you lie if a Nazi comes and asks you if you're hiding Jews, right? Okay, you know that you are not supposed to lie, but are you faithful to that law at that precise moment, right? What it means to lie at that precise moment, we have certain contradictions of what it means to lie, what it means to take the other as an end and not as a mean, right? So we have these contradictions with the law, right? That precisely show us that there is split between the faithfulness of the subject enunciating the law and the law as a universal rule, right? Uh, and that precisely is the problem of universality against the particular, right? There can be particular cases that are exceptions to the law, right? But well, that's something else. Yeah.
Yeah, and I also want to tie this back before we get into the schema part, just thinking about how the law functions in the unconscious of, like, for instance, the law of the prohibition of incest, right? Which is the famous taboo that also has a sort of anthropological investigation as well, with like Strauss and everybody else. But what's interesting about, like, the unconscious is that sexuality is founded on this sort of prohibition of incest. Like, you cannot enjoy your mother. And the way it plays out in the totem and taboo, you have this way in which society is founded on this prohibition, but also because it's founded on the patricide, right, of the tyrannical father who enjoys all the women, and threatens castration upon the brotherhood, right? um but I think I find that interesting because not only is it the sort of mark of the unconscious in the form of the name of the father, and the instantiation of prohibition, but the fact that, like, there's also the element of enjoyment as well that comes with it. It's like through the prohibition there are certain enjoyments, but I think to your point about bringing in the super ego, for the pervert, like, the super ego instrumentalizes, or the pervert instrumentalizes the super ego of enjoyment, versus the neurotic who may even have perverse fantasies. But not only does prohibition keep them from enacting that itself, the super ego then comes in to make the neurotic suffer for having failed to do the thing, but then also to even try to do the thing to begin with, right? Because it misrecognizes the law in itself, right? I just find
Mm-hmm.
that fascinating, but also, like, this interesting, like, law of prohibition, because, like, well, if everybody was doing that, then there would be no society, I guess. Like, there would be no, like, structure, there'd be no familial structure in itself that divides us.
Yeah. I mean, we can think this is of course, the maxim of suppose the rule of jouissance, right? So in a way, we can read that in the graph of desire at the upper level, right? But the question of jouissance, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it is different that from the question of the desire of the other. But this is the about the jouissance of the other. And this is what Lacan later in the text questions how in Christianity the jouissance of God has always been hidden, right? We don't discuss about the jouissance of God, right? How God
Yeah.
enjoys
Yeah.
us or enjoys the world, enjoys his creation, right? And that's the issue about the upper level and the question of jouissance that is always about the demand to enjoy, the demand therefore to cross the limit, right?
Mhm.
To sacrifice, right? Now, okay, you can see, okay, both the neurotic and the pervert, they both have relationship to pain, right? But the structural relationship, the structural identification as pervert neurotic, precisely the fact that the neurotic has a relationship with this ideal to be, right? The ideal ego, right?
Yeah.
And therefore there is the problem of course you want to be like this ideal and okay there
And
is
the
this
ego
possibility of
ideal.
yeah, and there is this possibility of course of of failing to be it, and the superego demanding you to meet the standards, right? So we have the relationship to pain, right? Now, this is not the same as the one of perversion, right? Because the pervert doesn't go through this secondary castration. What is it
Yeah,
called?
the separation. It clings to
Separation.
the alienation, of the mother, the image of the mother, and the phallus,
Yes,
phallus, as you will say in Seminar 4, with fetishism.
right. So, so the pervert has no relationship with this ideal ego, right? The enjoyment is not from becoming someone, right? By by knowing very well that they are the object of the other, right? And therefore, they know very well how to please the other, how to manage their enjoyment, right? And this is precisely not how the neurotics work. The neurotic, on the contrary, will reject being the object of the other. We will have a negative relationship towards being this object, right? Because they have undergone separation, right? And they're free, in a way, from the demands of the other, right? Which is the pervert is still attached to it, right? They know how very well how to make the other enjoy and gain enjoyment, precisely because they are attached to the demands of the other, right? In their own way, they understand it, of course, right?
Mhm.
So in the case of the sadist, right? And this is how Lacan understands the sadist knows very well that by punishing the victim, he will gain satisfaction, right? And it is by this mechanical and repetitive action that in the pain is externalized in the other, right? And he gains enjoyment by becoming these objects, and maybe in that way we can talk about the Sadi's schemas, right?
Yeah,
Uh,
which I will share my background, new whiteboard, and let's see, should be able to share. No, that's not what I want. How do I go to the background? Because right now you're just seeing my home screen, right?
yeah, yeah, yeah.
That's weird how I was able to do it before. Uh, whiteboard, whiteboard. Uh, 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 uh. Yeah, this is. Can you see it or no?
Yeah, yeah, I see it now. I see it now.
Okay.
Um,
Uh,
so
just want to make sure that it's.
maybe, mhm.
Say that again. Sorry.
No, maybe we should start with the schema L, because I
Uh-huh.
think that it, of course, gets more clear when we understand how the schema L works, right?
hmm hmm Well, it's saying that sharing the screen will close the whiteboard for everybody, which is weird. I'm trying to share the white because I don't
I
know.
was looking at the whiteboard. I
Okay,
was looking
okay,
at the whiteboard. Yeah.
okay. That's yeah. Maybe it will. Yeah. Okay, I see. Because it's yeah. All right. Sorry, guys, for this technical get up. But yeah, here's the. So, what is the name of the schema exactly? Does it have a specific name?
Schema L. Yeah.
Yeah, okay, this is still considered schema L. So, yeah, the way he has this, and we're talking about these schemas on the first one. So, on the top corner on the left, we have V. On the bottom one, we have this like little lozenge arrow, which is supposed to be
No, that's already the sadean schema. That's already sadean schema.
right, right. So,
So
which one did you want to? I thought it was supposed to be these ones, right?
no, yeah, yes, but I think that it gets clear if we understand the schema L, right?
Right. Okay.
Uh, can I draw? Oh yeah, can I draw?
You should be
Okay,
able to draw. Yeah. I'm gonna finish this
okay.
drawing.
So okay, so we have these,
hmm Which is
then we have the
the little one.
other, right?
Yeah.
The small other. And this goes back to the ego. And then we have A. That's the big order. And then here, and
Mhm.
this is unconscious. Right?
Yeah.
So
So
just
yeah,
like you
that
can see.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, this is crucial because just by looking at the setting scheme, is like, what the fuck? How that came with that idea, right?
Hmm.
But if you understand that this schema L, okay, we'll write this, draw the lines, yeah, and this one also goes here, right? Yeah. So if we see, of course, there is the S, the subject. Of course, this is the he understands that as the it, right?
Yeah, yeah.
So this is completely unconscious, right? And by we perceive this, the other, right? So we have an imaginary relationship with the other, right? A speculative other, and it's
Hmm.
by having this other that I understand my own ego as a whole, right? And so that's why from the unconscious subject, right, we have the other, and this the other goes back to the ego,
Yeah,
right, as
it's
a whole,
specular. Yeah, specular image, and it's what will develop the ego, right? Whereas
right,
the big S and big A is the reference point of the unconscious. But it's not like this perfect connected graph, because like that intersection blocks out the ability for the S and A to communicate like harmoniously. As he calls it, it's the imaginary relation of language, like the imaginary,
right.
um
Yeah, the wall of language,
the
right?
wall of language.
So
Yeah.
right, because yeah, as you can see, there is a relationship between S, then connects to the other, and then back to the ego, right?
Mhm.
So
Yeah.
but the big other is the only one that is not caused by any other, right? And I mean, this schema L was used by Lacan to understand how is the relationship with the analyst, right? So there is not like there is this wall of language, right? That's of course then we have the problem of the countertransference, right? And it was used to understand that there is a barrier between this the analyst and the analyst, right? But nonetheless, there is this relationship between the big other, because at the beginning, right, Lacan understands the analyst to speak from the place of the big other, right?
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
that's why you have A here, right? And then there is this unconscious relationship, but it's unconscious, right? It's not clear and pristine as the spoken language, right? But nonetheless, it goes through, it comes through, right? It comes through the sleeps, right? It comes through dreams, right? So
Uh,
nonetheless, there is,
I was just gonna say, and like why he wants like the analyst to be in the position of the big A's, because like if it's like a obsessional neurotic, they want to place the analyst in the position of the small other, to which that
Mhm.
the ego in relation to the small other constitutes the what you'll call in the early seminars the Hegelian master slave dialectic, right? Um,
And
the
that's why there's rivalry between the two of them, right?
Yeah.
Conflict between the two of them, right? Um, so yeah, I mean, this is the schema L, right? And now if we turn it around, so we will see that this A uh, is becomes turns to this position, right? But of course, we can see that instead of the big order, we have the small, the object PTA, right? And this is a turning point also in seminar 8 about transference, because Lacan is moving away from the idea of the big order, right? Because the relationship of the big order is also the relationship of the name of the father. So this comes along with seminar 5 and 6 about the name of father, about there is no order of the order, right? So forth, right? And that's why he moves to the idea that the analyst doesn't speak or doesn't take the position of the big order, but of the object PTA, right? And that's why the only change, visible change, is this one, right? Is the object PTA. Then the ego, right, is the will for Kant, right? That's clear, right? Then
That's
the
a V, and
divided
it's supposed to be the will or the voice of conscience, right?
no, the will, just the will.
Just the
Yeah,
will. Okay.
yeah, because the voice will be object PTA, right?
Right. Right.
And yeah, and the speculative order in this case will be divided subject, and the S um, almost have the same meaning. It's a pathological subject, right? So the it in this case, right? So that's why there is a turn. If we turn it 90 degrees to the right, right, we get the first graph of Kant Avec Sade.
And he also
Uh,
places logins in the middle of A and S to constitute that the formula for fantasy is operative in here.
right, right, right. And yeah, this formula fantasy is introduced that in seminar 5, right? I think you have been reading that, right?
Yeah,
Seminar
yeah,
5,
yeah, yeah, yeah.
right? But in this case, it is shift, right? So precisely, this is the fantasy of perversion, right? Is the object that's causing the the divided subject, right? And it's not like a subject desiring an object, but on the contrary. But in this case, what is interesting is that uh, there is a causal relationship between all of them. So A causes B, the will, and the will then causes the divided subject, and then this divided subject causes the pathological subject, right? And this is, Lacan makes it clear that this has to do with the category of causation in Kant, right? So there is this causal chain. But of course, there is this Kant didn't have an understanding of unconscious, so Kant couldn't understand how there could be an unconscious causation, right? But in this case, it is the superego, right? So the A is the voice of reason for Kant, the superego in psychoanalysis, right? That affects the will of the subject, right? Affects in the case if you're guilty of something, you it's clear like that you have a negative relationship. But even if you are faithful to it, there is the separation between the voice of me enunciating the categorical imperative, and then the categorical imperative as stated from the aspect of the will of the ego in a way, right? So already we can see that the split between the subject of enunciation, right? The par lettre, the speaking being, and the ego, the subject of the statement, right? Of the I of the statement. And but yeah, and because for Kant, the only relationship will be that of the will to the pathological subject, right? So the will demands the pathological subject to act accordingly to the moral law, right? But with Lacan, we have a much more complex understanding of what's going on because we understand that there is a split, right? And this is the Sadean schema precisely because in the relationship between the sadist and the victim, um, we can say this is the sadist and this is the victim, right? The the sadist on one side demands the victim to submit, right? So they divide the victim, right? They submit the victim, right? So that's why the will takes this position and then affects the divided subject, meaning that the the sadist as from the place of the ego, right? Demands the victim to submit and to create this to suffer and in their body, right? So that's this causation to into the pathological subject, right? To experience pain, right? And therefore, from the superego or from the voice of the sadist, we have this whole chains of causations, right? And But nonetheless, we can also understand that there is a relationship between something that is conscious and something unconscious, right? Because even for the sadist, the fantasy of the lower section is still unconscious. And in the case of Sade, this is clear because what is the purpose of submitting these little girls, innocent girls, like in the case of Justine, to go through this treatment, is because Sade wanted to destroy the goodness of these girls, right? And he wanted to place the girl Justine and this level between the two deaths, right? And
Yes.
to maintain them, right? To keep them in this limit, not to kill them, right? But to keep them in this liminal space, right? As much as possible, uh, precisely to destroy not the goodness within them, but the goodness in the afterlife, right?
Right. Well, I also wanted to mention because I drew that little D with the arrow addressing the little object A, which you've also designated as voice and superego, because like I think that ties into what he says right here in 652 pagination 773. Desire, which is the little D, is the henchman which splits the subject, right? No doubt calling itself no doubt willing to call itself the will to jouissance. And then he says on the next page about how the formula for fantasy of A, lozenge, and S, he says, where is it right here? He says, yeah, indeed, it relates to pleasure that has been placed by the instrument of objet A here to the kind of sustained division of the subject that experience orders. So it's like the desire is supposed to be the other's desire, which addresses the A, which occupies the place of a voice and superego, which hits both the will, that's V, and then addresses the split subject, which both the A and the other's desire continue to bar and thus producing above the pathological subject, which is very interesting that
Mhm.
because I never thought of it like this, but I think this makes perfect sense in which you made this division of the sadist versus the victim, because it then brings a lot of clarification of why the Sadean fantasy would operate as such, because it is the other's desire that is being addressed that would cause the will to jouissance. And in this case, the Sadean fantasy of taking away the goodness in his female protagonists, right? His female heroes, and also any possibility of the afterlife of going beyond, right? But in this sense, keeping them in the cycle of the will to jouissance and the other's desire in a cold and cruel way.
Yeah, I mean, the point is that this is a paradoxical point, and this is what Lacan refers to, is that, of course, the sadist wants to destroy this uh, absolute absolute goodness, right? Uh, but by doing so, right, and this is the paradox, by doing so, he becomes the object, right? He becomes this immortal object that he wants to destroy, right? So the
Right.
whole point of destroying the goodness was to destroy this immortality of the good in the other. But by doing so, he becomes this object, right? This immortal object that,
Mm.
by pure repetition, right, is becomes the instrument of the other, right?
Mm-hmm.
And yes, as you say, this is the desire of the other. It speaks from the desire of the other, and that's why we have this fantasy between a losange divided subject, right, in which the voice or the superego is the one causing the fantasy of submitting the subject to this division, right? Um, yes, and this is precisely the fact that it is different from the other schema. Uh, I refer it as a masochist schema because it makes sense to me.
The
Precisely,
the one that's in the few pages after like 657.
yes, yes, precisely because okay, so Freud had the idea that there was almost reciprocity between sadist and masochist, right? And Lacan tries to make sure that it is nonsensical to think that way, but because uh, there is no relationship between sadist and masochist. It's not like Justine is a masochist for submitting to to the will of the pervert, right, of the sadist, right? Uh, but instead, there is a completely different relationship, right? The masochist works in a different fantasy and relationship to the other, and precisely because in the case of the sadist has a relationship with the other by creating pain in the other, right? Precisely because they need to externalize pain. Well, the masochist finds pain within itself, right? So it internalizes pain, right? And that's why the masochist is the truth of the sadist, right? Because the sadist has a relationship with pain, but the sadist needs to externalize it, needs to place it outside, right? It needs to place it at the level of the other, right? And that's why uh, the sadist, in a way, needs to do that to get closer to the other, right? In the fact that there is uh, the there is a refusal of castration, right? Uh, the only way to achieve this closeness with the other is through pain. And that's why
Yeah.
the pervert kind of cheats, right? Cheats with enjoyment, finds a short circuit to for satisfaction, right? It
Right.
doesn't
And
go
so
through castration.
yeah, exactly. And so for the viewers, I drew down the bottom the second schema that Luis was referring to, which I think in the actual essay, Lacan refers to the schema as one that Sade himself submits to in regards to, I believe it's his mother-in-law who he lived with.
Yeah.
So in a sense, like he is subjecting himself to a sort of masochistic thing. Because I think as you were saying, yeah, like it's not that that sadism or this term sadomasochism represents something where like okay the sadist seeks a masochist and a masochist seeks a sadist. No, not at all. There are two different logics, right? But I think what we see is the fact that Sade ultimately with his own sadistic fantasy subjects himself to a form of masochism, right, in this instance with regards to the the mother-in-law. And it's funny, I see this depiction in a lot of like um movies or TV shows where we could see like this sort of pathological serial killer that seems to have a perverse fantasy that they act out, have a relationship with a feminine figure at a young age in which they're submitted to like this strong infantilism, where like they're constantly being subjected to like this smothering criticism and demands of the mother, and yet they still hold on to this internal image of femininity and that voice that makes them act right. But they feel like as like infantile, they're subjected to this more masochistic thing of the cruelness of being tortured yet sustained by the sublimity the sublimity of the feminine. And like I know for Masak, right, Masak has the thing about like the women having a contract with him and educating them on how to properly like be cruel to him, and like he has this whole thing. I haven't read it specifically, but I'm going off of like the commentary that Deleuze gives in his Sade and Masak work. um
Hmm.
and I think he's kind of Lacanian in the sense because like he makes the same argument, and also that for Sade, it's instrumentalized reason that's indifferent to any specific person, right? Um,
Hmm.
it's like a sort of educational contractual thing that the masochistic logic seems to impose on. But I think if I understand correctly, I'll just add with this that for Sade, there is something that almost resembles a sort of economic masochistic undermining with his relationship as a person to his mother-in-law in the schema.
Yeah, I mean, there's a problem, I think, because I mean, was Sade a masochist, right? I'm not sure, right? I'm
Yeah,
not sure if because I mean, even in his texts, okay, we can say, okay, well, there is a difference between the Sade of as an author in his fantasy and Sade as a person, how he was living. But I think it would be uh, problematic to make these differences as Sade a sadist or a masochist. But contrary, understand that the truth of a sadist is masochism, right? And therefore, the truth of Sade still grounded in certain masochism, even if he didn't, even he rejected such pain, right? Because the sadist needs to reject pain, needs to externalize it, right? But nonetheless, he is no different from a masochist, right? Because there's still this relationship with pain, right? And I think how I would like to read it, right? That it's not that Sade was a masochist, but the truth of Sade was it was formed this masochistic logic, right? Because nevertheless, it's not that Sade submitted to a dominatrix, right? It's not that Sade was because in the case of Masoki, he wants to search a lady to whom he could, submit and become her slave, right? And she will become this absolute, right? So it's not only his own fantasy at work, right? But I don't think that's the case in Sad, right? But but precisely the fact that Sad becomes this object of the of his mother-in-law. He becomes this naughty boy of the mother-in-law, right? But nonetheless, he works in relationship with the will of the mother, right? And this is why, from this position, right, the will of the mother finally subjectivizes Sad, right? So we have Sad as a subject, right? And this subject, as Lacan points out, creates this pathological subject that Lacan's read as what we experience when we read his works, or what the people next to him, his family, his wife, experience because of his naughty behavior, right? So, so if Lacan describes in that way, it's not a description of a masochist, right? It's still the description of a sadist. That's why I read it more as the case that the truth of a sadist is nonetheless working through certain logic of masochism, right? uh, in the way that it becomes an object of the other, right? Because in this graph, there is no such relation between becoming the object of the other, right? But in the graph of masochism, there is a relationship becoming the object of the other, right? But it is a negative relationship, I think, in the case of Sar, because he nonetheless tries to reject the will of the mother. But the will of the mother is so powerful, right? This is the case that she's a torment for him and his wife, right? That's why he's sent to the Bastille because of his mother-in-law uh, files a lawsuit against him. He calls the police, right? And that's why he's incarcerated, right? So he has this very intense relationship with his mother-in-law and kind of tries to reject it, right? And that's why he's subjectivized, right? Uh, that's how I like to read it.
Yeah, and it's interesting comparing the two because in the first schema, like I pointed out, it's the desire addressing objet at first, and it's this will to jouissance, whereas in the second one, uh, little a is already addressing to the other, right? As the V is what will or other, whereas like
Mhm.
the desire is already splitting the subject right there, thus making him a pathological subject, but also like as you said, this like conflict between the will of the other and whatever their enjoyment is, and the desire that splits them, right? And I guess that
Mhm.
does make him an object of the mother's will, versus in the other one, uh there is this one in which like this will to jouissance, and the voice is fulfilling a fantasy, and a fantasy
Mm.
that it relates to the other, and splits the subject by its desire, right?
Mhm. Right. There is no fantasy in the second graph, right?
Right,
There's
right,
no
right, right.
losange,
Yeah, there's no losanges. Yeah, that's also
right?
a point too, right?
And we can also think it because again, I think there is this is section is unconscious, this is conscious, right?
Yeah.
And therefore, the Sad takes the position of an object. He knows very well how to deal with the reasons of the mother, right? And and in this case, that's why desire is still in the same position because it's the section that is unconscious, right? So it's this unconscious desire, right? Yeah, but there is no possibility of fantasy here. Uh, Probably because in this case, this is a fantasy of the sadist, right? That needs to externalize pain, reject pain, right? Well, here we have, I'm not sure, this is my interpretation, but we have a more revelatory aspect of the nature of the pervert, right? That there is a relationship with pain, of becoming the object of the other, right? So there is no fantasy. It's very clear, conscious that he takes this position, right?
Yeah, and then it's also the distinction between, like you said, this graph. Like, I'm sure we could use it for like other things, but like as Lacan introduces the second graph, it pertains to Sade himself versus Sade the writer, um, the author who has an experience and a fantasy around that, which is on the first graph. And so I guess like if the second graph, uh, even though it's supposed to relate to Sade himself, I wonder if it's like a sort of way in which it's like how we, if we could quarter shift it, like how this then creates the Sadean fantasy or the sadist as such. We have this first graph, which there is no lozenge, or the second graph that has no lozenge, but still we still have a spaltung, we still have something splitting the subject, and thus also submitting to the other's will, and then this enacting out a fantasy of going out and adhering to that will, by subjecting others to some sort of sadistic act or torture, right? Because what is the
Mhm.
pervert but the bearer of true faith, right? And
Mhm.
to instrumentalize their enjoyment to evoke the other's gaze and the other's anxiety in that moment to plug it.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, precisely. And this nonetheless, Lacan reads Sade to somehow have a more honest relationship with desire, right? Because for Kant, there is no, he needs to reject desire, he needs to reject pleasure. But what Kant is not aware is that he defines enjoyment to pleasure, but
Mhm.
he's not aware that by rejecting pleasure, the categorical imperative has a grounding in pain, and pain also can create enjoyment, right? And that's why with Kant we have moral masochism that is not the same as Miller also makes clear, it's not the same as the masochism of the pervert, but it still has a relation with pain, right? And that's how they both are united, right? Because of this relationship with pain, the relationship of the superego, right? That demands you to cross the barrier, right? So in the case of Sade, this demand was about following his desire, right? So in the contrary, Kant couldn't do that, right? That's why we have the case of the Lacan quotes Kant about whether if a man will, if a man wants to sleep with a woman, right? If the prince tells him, well, if you do that, you will be killed, right? Uh, no man will take such risks because it becomes clear that it's not worth it, right? It goes against the law, right? But Lacan reads this has a, it is problematic in itself because person that rejects uh, not sleeping with the woman because he will be killed is following the pleasure principle, is following his well-being, right? It's not uh, following his desire, is not going against his own pleasure. The pervert in this case, right, will enjoy, on the contrary, risking his well-being, right? And
Right.
this is why the Sade has a more truthful relationship with desire, right, than Kant. Kant, on the contrary, is able to enunciate the law by repressing desire, and that's why I think we can also read that in the master discourse, right? We have
Mhm.
S1 precisely because there is the repression of divided subject, right? Uh, and from which later on we can think there is surplus enjoyment out of a surplus enjoyment grounded in pain, in grounded in the because for Kant, okay, you reject pleasure, right? But if you do the good thing, you will somehow uh, gain moral enjoyment or moral pleasure, right? And I read that as precisely how we can understand surplus enjoyment in the master discourse, right? Not the surplus enjoyment of the capitalist discourse, right? Because I think that's something else, but at least of the master discourse that it makes it clear that there is a rejection of jouissance. And this is
Mhm.
precisely how Kant rejects jouissance, but nonetheless, this jouissance leaks, right? There is leaks through surplus jouissance, right? And the enjoyment that you gain exactly through the rejection of jouissance, right?
Well,
So,
that's so interesting that you say that because I can't help but now think about, bringing up Pascal in Seminar 16 when the
mhm,
problem of God has nothing to do with the proof of his existence, like the God of the philosophers, but rather on the belief and the wager of eternal happiness in the next life, right? And I think that's the whole reason of playing the wager. And the wager not only evokes the subject of jouissance, but also God as well. And God's not playing the game, right? But the subject of jouissance doesn't get evoked until the game is playing. And and you're putting that on the wager, you're putting that on the table, right? If
mhm.
believe or not, right? And if I believe in God exists, well, then I'll get eternal life. Versus if I don't, then I'm going to hell. But then it's like, well, if God doesn't exist and I believe, well, I lived a good life. And if he doesn't exist and I don't believe, well, you know, there's that. But I find that interesting because, well, I mean, you mentioned in the Sadean fantasy in the form of his novels that, like Justine, Juliet, etc., that their goodness is taken away from them by enduring this torture or enduring the will, the jouissance, and even the possibility of afterlife. But in here, it's renouncing, and yet it's bearing true faith and the promise of something of surplus, right? But for Lacan, it still has the logic of some type of perversion because it's still bearing some faith into, the other. And I think at least for Sade, though, it's the will to enjoyment here and now, the will to desire, and the way I could instrumentalize that, right? And
Yeah, in seminar 16, he mentions in the first session, he mentions how the rise of the market works through this perverse logic, right? Because he knows very well what the other wants, right?
right,
And
right,
that's how the market works. And that's how Pascal, thinking about the market, right, understands that, okay, you can believe in God, even if you can say that you believe in God, even if you don't, right? And you will, gain satisfaction, gain jouissance in the afterlife, right? You go to heaven, right? But of course, Pascal doesn't consider the fact there is nonetheless something sacrifice, right? And this is what Lacan introduces. But the logic of Pascal is precisely that of a pervert. You just need to do this, right? You know, right? You know that by doing this, you will gain jouissance, right? And this is precisely going back to the case of Sades. He knows very well that by torturing the other, he will gain jouissance, right?
yeah,
And that's different from the ethics of psychoanalysis, in which it's an act, is passagewal act, is an act of unconscious, an act that you don't know what will happen. You don't know the consequences of your act, right? Of in the case of free association, for example, right? So, uh, and it's for this reason why neither Sade nor Kant are representatives of the ethics of psychoanalysis, right? Because both of them have problems, right?
mhm, mhm,
Uh, Sade is so adherent, Kant is so adherent to the law that he cannot accept the fact that there is an unconscious desire and that it needs to be enunciated, needs to be acted. And Sade, of course, doesn't see how his desire for jouissance takes the form of a law, right?
Mhm.
Because at the end of the text, Lacan makes it clear that Sade rejects the law precisely in the fact of the prohibition of the mother, right? He
Yeah.
rejects the fact that there is no full jouissance, right? There is no possibility of gaining absolute jouissance, right? And I mean, we can think that of common understanding of hedonism, right? You have the belief that you can achieve happiness in this life, right? And you seek all pleasures precisely because you want to achieve this bliss in this life, right?
Yeah.
Jouissance in this life, and there is no understanding that there is a law against this, against obtaining this jouissance, right? And for Kant, this is already barred. There's already a provision of having jouissance, the highest good in this life, right? You can only achieve it not even in the afterlife, because that will be cheating. You know, that will be okay. If I act good, I will have happiness in the afterlife. But because no, even in the afterlife, that's why you need an immortal soul. Even
Yeah.
in the afterlife, you still need to behave, right? And
Mhm.
only God, only Him, right, from the position of the ego idealist, let's say, only Him can judge you and tell you if you actually behave or not, and therefore you're worthy of the highest good, right? So there is this understanding of the law, right? But again, Kant cannot accept these exceptions to the law, right? Moments in which there are certain contradictions, right, in
Right.
between the subject of enunciation, the subject of the statement, right? Which the desire of the subject is in contradiction with the law, right?
Yeah, and I'm reading the last page, which with your remark regarding Sade. You know, he says, "Sade thus stopped at the point where desire and the law became bound up with one another," and then he goes like all the way down, giving like a further exegesis, and then he says right here, um, you know, you know, syphilized and sewn shut, the mother remains prohibited. My verdict is confirmed regarding Sade's submission to the law, and that desire and law become bounded up where to the point where Sod has to stop at this deadlock, right? Because as you said, he rejects the law and wants to affirm enjoyment by following his desire, not realizing that in doing so he thus reaffirms the law, even if he wishes. And I don't know if he actually does, but I would imagine so. Like, in a sense, not only does he reject law, but he tries to find ways, whether in real life or mainly through the Sadean fantasy, to transgress law. But thus, as Zizek always says, transgression isn't subversion, right? Perversion isn't subversion of the law. It reaffirms it, and sustains it. Transgression
Mm-hmm.
needs the law. But then, like that last point, it's that like the mother, Saad's own mother, remains like prohibited for him. So there is, in a sense, a limit to Saad's own enjoyment as well, right?
Right, exactly, because in the case of perversion, there is a disavowal of castration, right?
Yes.
Well, in the case of neurosis, we have a repression of castration, precisely because the neurotic cannot accept that the other is barred, right? Therefore, that you don't know what the other wants from you, right? That's what it brings you anxiety. You don't know what the other really wants from you, right? And it's a question of desire, right? So in the contradictions that we face about lying, for example, what should I do? What the other does really want from me, right? That's the question that the neurotic asks, right? And this is not the question that the pervert will ask, because he's not a concern about the desire of the other, but he's really attached. He's really attached with the demands of the other, and how he knows very well how to satisfy those demands, right? There is no possibility of asking about the desire, because that's already higher level, right? It's already accepting a castration, so really accepting the fact that you are within bounded to the law, right? A law in a certain way that you really don't know what the other wants from you, right? And yeah, that's how we can differentiate the two of them, right? And we can think in a way how the neurotic is closer to the side of the other, but always tries to reject his encounter with it, right?
Yeah. Damn, man. We literally went through this whole entire essay, pretty much touching on a lot of points, but also really breaking down these graphs, which I think like I don't know. I mean, I think you're more aware about. There is like a couple of secondary sources regarding these two schemas that he introduces, or is
I pretty much I read the what is the name? The Law of Puissance, right, by Ferenc, Christian Ferenc,
right.
and he pretty much the Usance principle. I'm sorry, the Usance principle.
That's what it was. Yeah, yeah.
And yeah, he's very good. He covers Kant, he covers Sade, and how Lacan reads both of them, right? Because is the challenging aspect, of course, of this text is that, yeah, I mean, even Lacan is aware. He makes a pause and said, okay, if you're still, if you still don't know about the second critique, you should stop here and read the second
Yeah.
critique, right? Because without having a good grasp of it, it becomes difficult to follow through it, right? But that's Lacan in general, right? He always touches other authors that none of not many people know, right? I mean, he has very obtuse readings of them, right? So that's a complexity of reading Lacan all the time.
I mean, yeah, that's yeah, especially in like all the parentheticals when it comes to reading like the
Yeah, yeah.
I mean like even subversion of the subject, I was like had to read each page like
Oh
slow.
no.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
But
So
no, thank you again, Luis. That was excellent, an excellent breakdown of both Kant and Sade. And like I mean Kant is difficult, but I think he's just dry.
mm,
He's dry and he's technical. I think his lectures are a lot easier to read, but still like I think the this essay is definitely it's difficult because it's bringing two complex concepts from like two different thinkers, but also in the way that he writes it's almost like it is subject you to some type of torture.
yeah, definitely, definitely. I think yeah, Lacan was a sadist when writing his texts, especially the crease, right? He's more permissive with his seminars, right? But the crease are really a pain in the ass to read, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Before we
But
conclude, do you have anything to plug in? Are you I know I mentioned earlier about like the your dissertation that you're working on, but do you have any writings or do you have your own blog or anything that you do? um
yeah, I mean my dissertation, my thesis is on the invocatory drive.
mhm.
So this plays a crucial role with the voice, right? And especially here in this text, right? Because it's the voice of the superego. And but also there's a possibility of thinking about the voice in the free association, right? But yeah, I'm still working on with this text. I was supposed to write an article a few months ago, but I keep finding new things, and
Which
hopefully
was the
soon I
one
will
on
have something.
Trump, right? It was the one that you're originally doing with Kant Avec Sade and Trump.
Yeah, no, yeah, not especially this more political text, but something more clear about the how the voice is at play in this work, right? Because I read this the case of the superego to be um, so Lacan in the seminar 11 talks about the drive circuit that is active, reflexive, and passive, right? And I read this to be, at least for Kant, to be the reflective section of the invocatory drive, because it submits to itself, it refers to itself, it causes itself, right? And actually, in seminar 16, he makes it clear that it's the voice acts upon itself, right? The voice demands the subject to act in a certain way, right? So this is I find it interesting how there is this relationship to self-consciousness too, and how also the superego is relates to the subject and moves it, right? Because that's crucial. It moves it to act and to submit to the law, right? And yeah, and I wrote these blogs about it as a side part because well, we were reading Kant Avec Sade, and I thought, okay, I have this text that I think I will cut from the article I was writing, and well, I just publish it, right?
Nice.
So I have that too. But yeah, I don't write too much there anyway. Sometimes
Yeah.
when I'm inspired. Yeah.
I don't know. That's good though. I'm looking forward to it. But yeah, thank you again. And I mean, like I said earlier, Luis has been a consistent member of the Emancipation. So again, tune into the reading group that we're doing right now on Seminar 9, which is really good and really dense. But I think it's really a fun read too. And
Yeah. No, actually, the seminar 9, of course, is somehow crucial for this text because is uh, is presented just before this text is written, right? So he's thinking about that at the same time. So yeah, this seminar 9 is going to be a ride to comprehend and unpack.
yeah, for sure. Well, thank you again for taking the time to do this. This was really fun. And yeah, thank you all for tuning in. And I hope you all learned something and enjoyed. Take care, y'all.